I bought the farm on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind where the sky hangs low and everything feels unfinished. The listing had been online for months, quietly ignored, stamped with one word that scared most buyers away: bankrupt. A former cattle operation that had collapsed under debt, sitting just beyond the clean, manicured borders of an HOA community that liked to pretend it owned the entire valley. What caught my attention wasn't the price, though it was absurdly low, but the survey map. The boundary line was clear.
The farm sat outside the HOA.
Not adjacent, not shared, outside. That detail mattered more than the acreage, the barns, or the cracked gravel road leading in. I'd dealt with HOAs before. I knew how far their confidence could stretch when unchecked. So before I signed anything, I verified everything twice. County records, zoning office, title history. No covenants. No easements in their favor. No shared access. The farm was legally, undeniably independent. The first week was quiet.
Too quiet.
I stayed on the property, sleeping in a small trailer while I assessed the buildings. Rusted gates, leaning fences, an old equipment shed full of dust and forgotten tools. The land itself was beautiful in a raw way: open fields, a tree line at the far end, and a shallow creek cutting through the back acreage. It felt peaceful, isolated, mine. On the fifth morning, I noticed a black SUV parked on the road near the entrance. It wasn't blocking access, just sitting there, engine off. I assumed it was coincidence. Maybe someone lost. But by afternoon, there were two more. No logos. No markings. Just dark vehicles, spaced out, watching. That evening, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read, "Community Security Notice." The message claimed the farm fell within the extended security interest of the HOA due to historical land use patterns. It informed me that HOA-appointed security personnel would be present, temporarily, to ensure community safety and compliance. There was no legal citation, no signature, just confidence. I didn't respond. Instead, I called the county again. Then my attorney. Both confirmed what I already knew. The HOA had zero jurisdiction. Sending security onto my land without permission wasn't just inappropriate, it was illegal. The next morning, I woke to the sound of engines. For vehicles now. Two men standing near my gate, wearing tactical-style vests with the word security stitched across the front. They weren't armed openly, but their posture said intimidation was the point. When I approached, they told me they were there on behalf of the HOA and that I should coordinate through proper channels. I asked them to leave.
Calmly. Clearly.
I told them they were trespassing and that I was documenting everything. One of them smirked and said, "We're just making sure nothing happens." That was the moment it became obvious. They weren't there to protect anything. They were there to surround, to pressure, to make me feel boxed in before I could settle. The HOA had decided that because the previous owner had folded, I would too. They underestimated two things. First, how thoroughly I had prepared. Second, how seriously the law treats private citizens pretending to be authorities on land they don't own. I stepped back, pulled out my phone, and made one call, not to the HOA, not to a lawyer, but to the local police dispatcher. I described the situation carefully. Unauthorized security personnel.
Trespassing.
Intimidation. The dispatcher paused, then said, "Stay where you are. We're sending units." The police arrived faster than I expected, red and blue lights cutting through the dull morning like a warning flare. 3 cruisers rolled in, followed by a county sheriff's truck. The men in the vests shifted immediately, their confidence wavering the moment real authority appeared. They straightened up, hands visible now, suddenly very professional. An officer approached me first, asking quietly if I was the property owner. I handed over the deed, still crisp from the closing, along with printed maps and the county zoning confirmation I'd kept ready. He nodded, walked a few steps away, and began speaking with his supervisor. Meanwhile, another officer questioned the so-called security team. Their story unraveled quickly. They claimed they were contracted by the HOA to monitor border activity. When asked for permits, authorization, or any legal basis for being on the land, They offered vague answers and deflected responsibility. One mentioned that the HOA president had told them it was fine. That answer didn't help. The sheriff joined the conversation, flipping through my documents slowly, deliberately. He pointed to the boundary line on the map and then gestured toward the road. "Everything beyond this point is private property," he said plainly. "And none of you have permission to be here." The mood shifted. What had started as a show of intimidation was now an investigation. The officers checked IDs. They ran the vehicle's plates. One cruiser repositioned to block the road, not to trap anyone, but to control the scene. I stood back and watched, documenting quietly. No shouting. No arguing. Just procedure. The men who had tried to surround my farm now found themselves answering questions they weren't prepared for. One of them tried to argue that they were preventing potential squatting due to the farm's bankrupt history. The sheriff shut that down immediately. "That's not your call," he said. "And you're not law enforcement." Within minutes, it became clear that the HOA hadn't just overstepped. They'd created a liability nightmare. The security company they'd hired lacked the authority to patrol private land. Worse, they had crossed onto it intentionally after being told to leave. That turned trespass into something more serious. An officer approached me again and asked a simple question. "Did you want to press charges?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said. Not out of anger, but necessity. If I let this slide, it would happen again. HOAs thrive on precedent. I wasn't about to become one. The arrests were methodical. Hands behind backs. Pat-downs. Rights read aloud. One by one, the men were placed into the cruisers they'd watched arrive earlier with such smug confidence. Their vehicles were searched and towed. The road cleared, not of me, but of them. As the last door closed, the sheriff explained what would happen next. Trespassing charges at minimum. Possible impersonation issues depending on how the security role was presented. He asked if the HOA had contacted me directly. I showed him the email. He took photos of it with his phone. "You did the right thing," he said. "This kind of thing gets out of hand fast if people don't shut it down early." When the police finally left, the farm felt different. Quieter, but also heavier, as if something invisible had been lifted. The land was still rough, still neglected, but now it was undeniably mine in practice, not just on paper. I didn't celebrate. I walked the perimeter instead, checking fences, gates, and markers. I posted no trespassing signs at every access point, not as a challenge, but as a line. Because I knew this wasn't over. HOAs don't retreat easily. And the embarrassment of watching their hired security hauled away in handcuffs would not sit well with people who believed they owned more than they did. The fallout didn't take long. By the next morning, my phone was filled with missed calls from unfamiliar numbers. Voicemails followed, each one more carefully worded than the last. HOA board members. Legal representatives. One message even tried to sound friendly, suggesting there had been a misunderstanding and proposing a meeting to clear the air. The sudden change in tone was almost impressive. Less than 24 hours earlier, they'd sent hired muscle. Now they wanted conversation. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I met with my attorney in person. We laid everything out on the table: the email, the trespass, the arrests, the vehicles, the security company's involvement. He listened quietly, then leaned back and smiled in a way that told me the HOA had made a catastrophic mistake. The use of private security to intimidate a landowner outside their jurisdiction wasn't just reckless, it opened them up to civil liability on multiple fronts. That afternoon, a formal cease and desist letter went out. It was brief, precise, and unforgiving. Any further attempt by the HOA, its agents, or contractors to enter or monitor the farm would result in immediate legal action. The letter also demanded preservation of all communications related to my property, including internal HOA emails and contracts with the security company. No room for deniability. No room for quiet cleanup. The response was immediate and chaotic. The HOA president called personally, leaving a voicemail that swung between apology and defensiveness. She insisted the board had acted out of concern and claimed the arrests were an overreaction by local police. That statement alone told me they still didn't understand what they'd done. Authority doesn't like being told no, especially when it's used to operating unchecked. Over the next few days, details began to surface. The security company distanced itself quickly, releasing a statement that they had relied on assurances from the HOA regarding jurisdiction. That didn't save them. Their contract, obtained through a public records request, showed they'd never verified boundaries. They'd simply followed instructions. The HOA, in turn, tried to blame a rogue decision by a single board member. No one wanted ownership of the disaster. Neighbors from the surrounding area started stopping by. Not HOA members, locals who'd lived near the farm long before manicured lawns and uniform mailboxes took over the valley. They brought stories. Similar intimidation, unauthorized notices, quiet pressure campaigns. Most had backed down in the past because fighting felt exhausting. Seeing the HOA finally face consequences shifted something. Then came the formal notice from the county. An investigation into the HOA's conduct was being opened. Impersonation concerns, improper use of private security, potential violations of local ordinances governing homeowner associations. The arrests had triggered scrutiny, and scrutiny brought exposure. The HOA board went silent after that. No more calls. No more emails. Their confidence had evaporated under the weight of real oversight. What they'd intended as a show of control had become a case study in overreach. I focused on the farm, repairs, planning, reclaiming neglected ground. The work was grounding, physical proof that intimidation hadn't worked. Each fence post reset, each gate reinforced, each cleared path felt like a quiet victory. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the tree line, I stood near the creek and watched the water move steadily through the land. The farm no longer felt like a contested space. It felt claimed. The HOA had believed isolation made me vulnerable. Instead, it gave me clarity. And as the legal process moved forward, one thing became increasingly clear. They weren't just losing control of my property. They were losing the illusion of power they'd relied on for years. The HOA finally resurfaced a week later, but not in the way I expected. Instead of more threats or thinly veiled apologies, they sent paperwork. Thick, official-looking packets arrived by certified mail, stuffed with legal language, policy references, and accusations dressed up as concern. They claimed the arrests had caused community distress and alleged that my refusal to cooperate had escalated the situation unnecessarily. It was an attempt to rewrite the narrative, to make intimidation look like protection and resistance look like aggression. My attorney laughed when he read it. Not because it was harmless, but because it was desperate. The documents referenced HOA bylaws that didn't apply to me, cited statutes out of context, and leaned heavily on emotional framing instead of legal standing. It was clear the board was scrambling, hoping volume might compensate for substance. We responded once, and only once. A formal rebuttal dismantled their claims line by line. Jurisdiction, none. Authority, non-existent. Responsibility for escalation, entirely theirs. The letter concluded with a warning that any further harassment would be added to an expanding list of documented actions for future proceedings. That shut the door on paper threats. But the real pressure shifted behind the scenes. Through public records and discovery requests, we uncovered internal HOA communications. Emails revealed discussions about containing the farm, worries about declining property values, and explicit acknowledgement that they knew the land wasn't under their control. One message suggested that if they acted confidently enough, I might fall in line like the last owner. That email changed everything. It showed intent, not confusion, not concern, strategy. The county investigation gained momentum after that. Officials interviewed board members individually. Some cooperated. Others tried to deflect. The HOA president resigned quietly, citing personal reasons. The security company formally terminated all contracts with HOAs in the county pending legal review. What had begun as a quiet intimidation attempt was now rippling outward, affecting relationships far beyond my farm. Meanwhile, I installed additional infrastructure. Gates reinforced. Cameras upgraded. Clear signage posted along every boundary. None of it was aggressive. All of it was lawful. The message wasn't hostile, it was final. Local news picked up the story briefly. Not with names or sensational headlines, but with facts. A homeowner outside HOA jurisdiction, unauthorized security presence, arrests made. That was enough. HOAs thrive on operating quietly. Public attention, even minimal, makes them nervous. Residents from the HOA community itself began reaching out anonymously. Some apologized. Others asked how I'd pushed back successfully. A few admitted they'd been pressured by the board for years, but never thought resistance would work. The illusion of inevitability was cracking. One afternoon, I received notice that the HOA's insurance carrier was reviewing coverage due to unapproved activities. That alone explained the sudden restraint. Financial risk gets attention faster than principle ever does. Standing on the farm that evening, I realized something important. This was no longer about me defending my land. It was about a system encountering limits it hadn't planned for. The HOA had relied on intimidation because it was easier than legality. They'd mistaken compliance for consent and silence for weakness. The farm, once bankrupt and forgotten, had become the line they couldn't cross. And the more they tried to push, the clearer it became that their authority only existed where people allowed it. As the wind moved through the fields and the lights from the distant neighborhood flickered on, I knew the final outcome was inevitable. Not because I was aggressive or clever, but because the law, when applied calmly and consistently, leaves no room for manufactured power. The resolution came quietly, without confrontation or spectacle, which somehow made it more satisfying. A final notice arrived from the county confirming the conclusion of their investigation. The HOA had been formally warned, cited for multiple violations, and ordered to cease any activity beyond its defined boundaries. Any future overreach, the letter stated plainly, would result in immediate penalties. No ambiguity, no room for interpretation. Shortly after, the trespassing charges against the hired security personnel moved forward. Most were resolved through plea agreements, fines, and formal acknowledgments of wrongdoing. The security company's name disappeared from local listings within months, rebranded and relocated after the damage to their reputation became impossible to ignore. Their association with the HOA had become a liability no one wanted to carry. The HOA itself changed tone permanently. Meetings were canceled, then resumed under new leadership with strict legal oversight. Notices to residents became cautious, carefully vetted, stripped of the commanding language that once defined them. The board stopped pretending it was law enforcement. Power, once challenged, doesn't recover easily. On the farm, life settled into a rhythm. Repairs progressed steadily. Fences stood straight. Gates closed securely. The creek flowed uninterrupted, reflecting the sky like it always had, indifferent to human arrogance. The land no longer felt like a battleground. It felt productive, grounded, restored. Neighbors who had once watched from a distance now waved when passing. A few stopped to talk, sharing how the HOA had grown quieter, more restrained. Property owners who had once feared retaliation began questioning notices, asking for proof, requesting legal references. The ripple effect was real. Resistance, it turned out, was contagious when it worked. I never celebrated publicly. There was no victory post, no announcement. That wasn't the point. The real win was the absence of interference. Silence. Respect. The farm existed on its own terms, as it always should have. Looking back, the pattern was obvious. The HOA had mistaken proximity for control. They'd seen a bankrupt property and assumed vulnerability. They believed confidence alone could replace authority. And when challenged, they escalated instead of retreating, exposing the emptiness beneath their claims. What stopped them wasn't anger or force. It was preparation, documentation, calm refusal. The law doesn't reward volume or intimidation. It rewards clarity. Once that clarity entered the picture, everything else collapsed under its own weight. On a clear evening, months later, I stood near the old barn as the sun dipped below the horizon. The fields glowed gold, then faded to blue. In the distance, the HOA neighborhood lights blinked on, orderly and contained within their borders. No vehicles watched the road anymore. No strangers stood at the gate. The farm had been written off once, reduced to numbers on a ledger and assumptions in a boardroom. Now it stood as proof that ownership means more than paperwork. It means understanding your ground legally, physically, and mentally, and refusing to surrender it to people who rely on fear instead of facts. I locked the gate, not because I was afraid, but because boundaries matter. Then I walked back toward the house, the land quiet behind me, reclaimed not through confrontation, but through resolve. The HOA had learned a lesson they wouldn't forget. And I had gained something far more valuable than acreage. I had gained certainty.